Good morning. I'm Eugene and I'm one of the pastors here. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that not all, but many of us may still feel a lot of emotions after the result of this Tuesday's election. Some of us may be feeling shock or anger, frustration, confusion, fear, and deep sadness, and some of us, none of that may apply. Some of you may have come to church today hoping to hear a word of comfort or clarity that might ease some of the pain that you're experiencing. But I'm going to be honest. I am genuinely not sure what the right thing to say is. And so for today, I want to resist the urge to make judgments or try to offer solutions. Instead, I'd like to encourage us all to commit to being together and to listening. Wisdom teaches us that in times of mourning, one of the greatest gifts we can offer is the simple act of being present. And so regardless of what you're feeling or not feeling, I want you to know that your pastors, overseers, and other ministry staff members are here for you, as we should be for one another. And so today I'm going to stick with the plan and preach about prayer. And although at first that may not seem all that related to what's going on, I believe it may be more important and relevant than we realize. So if you're just joining us, we've been in a series on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount titled Upside Down. And in it, we've been hearing about all the surprising ways Jesus seems to be turning our expectations about God and relationships and spirituality upside down, or rather, right side up. And in the past several weeks, we've been taking a longer look at the topic of prayer. Now, it's no secret that prayer is a big deal for Christians. Many have viewed prayer to be as essential as breathing. But it's not just Christians who value prayer. In fact, every civilization and culture in history has had some form of prayer. Even 12% of Americans who say they don't actually believe in God still pray. Prayer seems to be hardwired into us. We're made to pray. And perhaps for you, the events of this week in our nation have made the need for prayer especially palpable. But for something so universal and essential to our spiritual lives, there sure seems to be a lot of confusion about prayer. The Bible instructs us to pray numerous times, but it doesn't say all that much about how to actually do it. It almost seems to assume that we just know. One time I was busy multitasking at home, and so I asked my oldest son, Owen, to boil some water to help with dinner. And he said, "How?" And I thought I failed as a parent. But that's kind of what the Bible does with prayer. James writes, "Is anyone among you in trouble? Let them pray." How? Let them pray. That doesn't tell me anything. What is prayer? Is it just asking God for stuff? Do we have to pray a certain way in order for God to listen to us? Some pray quietly and some pray loudly. Some prayers are brief and some are long. Some pray with whatever words come to mind in the moment, and some prefer prayers that have been prepared beforehand. Have you ever wondered, what's the right way to pray? Have you ever felt guilt about not praying enough? Does prayer work? And if it does, what is it supposed to do? I may not be able to answer all these questions today, but I'd like to add to our conversation about prayer from a more personal angle. I like to share my own journey through prayer in the hopes that some of you might also recognize the road that you're on. Much of what I share today will simply reinforce what Pastor Dave has been teaching over the past 2 weeks, but I hope I'll also be able to bring some things about prayer into even clearer focus. Throughout my life, I've had a love-hate relationship with prayer. You might say it's complicated. Oftentimes, it's been such a source of life and spiritual nourishment, but also a source of deep shame and frustration. As a child, I grew up in Korean immigrant churches, and for those of you who don't know what that means, let me give you a little taste. Yeah, I know. Pretty intense, huh? And that's probably 5 in the morning. Of course, not all Korean churches are like this, but the churches I grew up in did not mess around when it came to prayer. Don't even get me started on what retreats were like. My mother, in her later years of life, lived in Korea and didn't work anymore, so she had lots of time on her hands. And so she would literally pray 5, 6, sometimes 7 hours a day. And during this time, the worst was when she would call me out of the blue. It'd be like, "Oh, hi, Mom, how are you?" "Fine." "Do you pray?" Yeah." "Really?" Suddenly, I'm not so sure. "Yeah." "Okay. Pray. Bye." I may have grown up with a bit of a spiritual inferiority complex. Prayer has always been hard for me, and there's no way I could measure up to the way my mom prayed. And so I just assumed that I didn't have the self-discipline to be better at prayer. Maybe I just didn't have that gift. And there were always things about prayer that didn't make sense to me or that didn't feel right, but I did it anyway. So I tried many different forms of prayer, some successfully and others not so much. But I kept at it as best as I could and eventually learned to be okay with praying badly. I knew God loved me anyway, so I was cool with it. 5 years ago, I was able to take my first sabbatical from church ministry. And I yearned for deeper connection with God. So as part of that time, I rented a small cottage on Cape Cod for 2 weeks. And I had a whole plan worked out. I was going to spend 2 whole weeks with just me and Jesus. I was going to power through that time with spiritual disciplines. I was going to read the Bible and fast and worship and pray like my mom for 8 hours a day. I was going all in to wrestle with God until I reached a new level of holiness. And it was a total fail. Even for an introvert like me, I knew it would be hard, but I didn't expect it to be torture. With no distractions, I was constantly distracted. I found that the more I tried to pray, the more I really didn't want to, which only served to reinforce my fear that I was a spiritual failure. When I heard Pastor Dave tell the story last week about St. Ignatius and how he moved into a cave to pray 7 hours a day, thinking it'd make him a spiritual hero, but instead came out more despondent than ever, I thought, yep, been there, done that. It's pretty clear I must be doing something wrong. So what's the deal? How does prayer work? In the passage that was just read for us, we see Jesus addressing some unhelpful practices and misconceptions about prayer that he saw around him. Jesus is speaking against those who were outwardly religious and used prayer as a way to boost their image and status. And Jesus continues to explain that when we pray, we ought to do so in private, where nobody sees but God. Maybe we don't stand on street corners to flaunt our ability to pray in public, but how many of us have used prayer as a way to impress others, or try to impress God, or perhaps make ourselves feel more spiritual? Jesus' point is that God is our one true audience. He's not speaking against praying in public. In fact, Jesus did it all the time. What he's saying is prayer is not for the public. Prayer is for God, not the expectations of others. Prayer is by its nature private, personal, intimate. You don't have to pretend or put on a show. God sees you. Sometimes going into a room and closing the door is the only way to escape our need to impress or please others. Christians have called this practice solitude. Jesus goes on to say that when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. He says, do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Many unintentionally treat prayer like it's magic or an impersonal source of power like electricity or the force. If you pray a certain way long enough, then God might hear you and grant you your wish. Jesus is saying that that's not how prayer works. It's not a way to manipulate God, as if that's even possible. If God knows everything we need before we even ask and knows what we need infinitely better than we do, then why even ask? If God knows everything already, you're not telling him anything new, so why pray? See, the purpose of prayer isn't to get what we need or want or to inform God of any new insights. My children don't need to ask me for food in order to receive it. I know what they need and I provide and care for them because I love them and they're my children. What do I, as a father, desire most from my children? Love, relationship, participation. I love it when they talk to me, or even when they don't and have nothing to say. They just want to spend time with me and be around. Prayer is first and foremost about relationship. It's not about technique or skill or even self-discipline. The essence of prayer is relating to God. Jesus modeled a relationship of deep intimacy with his heavenly Father, which he expressed in everything he did, from the ways that he loved and served others to how he taught and spent time with his disciples, how he ate and drank and laughed, and also at times when he went away by himself to pray. All of Jesus' life was prayer, a relationship with God the Father. The problem with learning how to pray is that you can teach words and methods, but you can't teach relationship. One time my sons and I were talking about school crushes. And I asked, do you ever talk to them? And one of them said, no, I never talk to them. And I was like, well, why not? And all you have to do is smile and say hi, be friendly, ask them a question. I found myself trying to coach them about how to talk to girls. And I can give them the exact words to say, and even teach them how to make eye contact and smile and act smooth. And all of that is only a little helpful. Eventually, they're going to have to figure out how to enter into an actual relationship. And they're going to have to do it on their own. They're going to have to go beyond technique and tips and learn how to be present and connect with somebody just as they are. And the same is true for prayer. Jesus continues in verse 9 and following by teaching the Lord's Prayer, which has been cherished and revered and prayed in thousands of languages over millennia. This then is how you should pray. What if Jesus didn't intend the Lord's Prayer to be the be-all and end-all of prayer, but just the beginning? What if the Lord's Prayer is simply Jesus coaching us on how to talk to God because we simply don't know how? All right, when you pray, be friendly, ask him a question, make eye contact, smile. Just say these words: Our Father in heaven, etc. Jesus knows he can't teach relationship. So all he can do is give us some basic instructions. And we're going to have to do the work of being present and connecting with God on our own. Teresa of Avila said, prayer is nothing else than being on terms of friendship with God. It's more than just words. Prayer is also not just asking for things. Asking for things can be a part of prayer, but prayer is much more than that. It's relationship. It encompasses all of life. And that should be at the same time liberating and utterly terrifying. It means there is no right way to pray. It also means there is no right way to pray. Oh no, what do we do? This past summer, I had a sabbatical for the second time since being in full-time ministry. But this time was very different from the first one I took 5 years ago. Over the last year, I was at the height of my exhaustion and stress. I was having trouble sleeping. I carried constant tension in my shoulders. The stress was so bad, sometimes I wanted to just crawl out of my own skin. And I felt like I hit a wall. I reached the limit of my own spirituality. My overfunctioning and overworking faith was exhausting me to the core. I was so tired by the end of the year that when my sabbatical finally came, I really didn't have much of a plan. I just needed to cross that finish line and stop. So I had some vacation time with my family, but mostly stayed at home. I scheduled some personal retreats and time with a spiritual director and a psychologist. I had some books I wanted to read. I went on a retreat with a few other pastors, but I didn't set any lofty spiritual goals or anything. I just wanted to rest. But something unexpected happened. I had a few opportunities for solitude, but unlike my first vain attempt during my first sabbatical, this time I went in with no plan other than to just be. I was going to have space and time and do whatever I wanted for days. And I know it sounds really unspiritual and self-indulgent, but I decided to be okay with doing nothing because I couldn't bring myself to do much else. And so for the first 2 days or so of just being alone, nothing happened. Literally. I slept. I woke up. If I wanted pancakes, I found an IHOP and got me some pancakes. If I wanted to watch a movie, I watched a movie. I sat at Barnes & Noble, drank coffee, and I read. But after about the second day, a strange thing happened. I noticed myself becoming more and more aware that I wasn't alone. God was my companion. I found myself slowing down enough to notice and be aware of His presence with me. Whether it was eating pancakes or taking a walk or just staring out at the ocean, I started naturally spending time with God, relating to Him as I went about doing nothing in particular. And perhaps this is what Sabbath is supposed to feel like. Sometimes there was speaking, but more often just an enjoyment of silence and being in God's presence. Somehow, I found myself praying all day long. And I couldn't explain it, and it made no sense to me at all, but I couldn't deny it. I finally outprayed my mother. I was intrigued by this newfound freedom. So over the next few weeks, I started to read and process more and went on a retreat with some other pastors. And it turns out there's a way to name what I was experiencing. And it's a tradition that goes back to the 3rd century. But I would argue Jesus is the one who modeled it first. It's called Christian Contemplative Prayer, or just contemplation for short. The word contemplation simply means to look at for a long time, or to gaze attentively. It's not primarily about thinking and knowing, which is what I'm so used to. It's primarily about seeing and experiencing. Like most spiritual practices we have today, it took shape after the Bible was written, so you're not going to find the words contemplative prayer in the Bible. Rather, contemplative prayer is a gift of the Holy Spirit working in the church through the centuries, from the desert fathers and mothers to the mystics in the Middle Ages, from Eastern Christianity to modern teachers like Thomas Merton. I'm still just learning about it, but I hope to share some of my experience so you might at least know how to start your own journey. I realized that before I could learn this new way of relating to God, of praying, I needed to unlearn a few things first. We often have to unlearn before we can learn. And I realized that I viewed prayer as the solution to a problem. The problem of my distance from God. It was what I was required to do to maintain my relationship with God in order to be heard and seen by Him. And as a result, I've always felt this over-responsibility for my own spiritual life. Prayer was a heavy burden instead of rest for my soul. Instead of prayer being life and relationship with God, it was the barrier. It's what I had to do in order to please Him, in order to feel close to Him. No wonder I never liked prayer. One of the greatest enemies to real prayer is fear. Fear that God doesn't hear us. Fear that God is displeased with us. Fear that we're doing it wrong. Fear that we're not good enough. And so we'll grasp at anything to soothe our fears. We'll depend on methods and techniques. We'll mimic others we deem more spiritual than we are. We'll rely on head knowledge to make us feel more secure and sure of ourselves. But all this only succeeds in avoiding God and making prayer more about us than about Him. Prayer is not an achievement. It earns no brownie points. You cannot impress God with prayer, no matter how much you strive, no matter how eloquent or insightful or earnest you are. Real prayer, just like salvation, is not a matter of effort or anything we do. It is a surrendering to the love of God. It's a relationship that He initiates and sustains and even brings to completion. We have a hard time with that because we're afraid of what might happen if we didn't try so hard, if we were not smart or good or spiritual or strong or liked or attractive or talented or capable or successful or holy or perfect. These are not our true selves. These are just superficial security blankets. What would we do without them? What would be left of us if we were to let go of these things we cling to for identity? What would we be if we were our naked, true selves before God? The answer is loved. You would be perfectly and completely loved, down to the deepest part of who you are. God is love. If the nature of prayer is relationship, then its purpose is love. And we don't know how to be in love with a God who is love. He's too big for us. All we can do is stumble around and get it in pieces. Whatever you think God's love is, can't possibly be it because it doesn't fit in our puny little minds. The challenge of real prayer is believing that God's unfathomable love is unconditionally available to you. That your prayers cannot make God like you any more or any less. That is the underlying reality of prayer. You cannot earn God or prove yourself worthy to Him. All you can do is become aware of Him. What was so surprising during my sabbatical is that I did it all wrong. I was too tired to be good and do things right, so I just didn't. And when someone asks you how to grow spiritually, you generally don't say, "Stop trying so hard." It doesn't make much sense. But it's as if I stumbled into a profound spiritual secret. Maybe this is what Paul meant when he said, "When I am weak, then I am strong." I stopped striving. I came to the limits of my own ability and was left with nothing but God. And I just stayed there. But I found that I didn't free fall into oblivion like I expected. Instead, I landed gently into a new but familiar place. God's love. Grace. It's a quiet place where there is no striving and no fear, just an awareness of the reality of God. He's bigger than my effort and my inadequate and bumbling prayers. God's love is like a rushing river. There's no point trying to thrash about or push the river along. All you need to do is to stay in it and let it carry you. Richard Rohr writes, "We cannot attain the presence of God because we're already totally in the presence of God. What's absent is awareness." So how do we practice contemplation? How do we become more aware of God? I'd like to reinforce two practices that keep us on this journey, and they are not new: silence and seeing. Notice that these two echo the first and second sermons Pastor Dave preached about in the previous 2 weeks. The first week, Dave taught on the practice of silence, and the second week, he taught on the prayer of examine, which is at its core a practice of contemplative seeing. So the first practice is silence. And why is silence so important? Well, if God is indeed love, it means He's a relational God. And that means our first job in prayer is to be present. Not concerned about the future or dwelling in the past, but being in the present. Not, "God, are you here?" but, "Lord, I am here now. I'm present." I'm sure all of us can relate to being physically with somebody, but not really being present. We might even appear on the outside like we're engaged listeners, but our minds are elsewhere. And I've been guilty of this many times. When Alice and I see each other after a long day, I know my first job is to be present. But in my mind, I'm still self-absorbed and distracted. What I often need is to look her in the eyes. Or I need 5 minutes to let the clutter in my head settle down so I can give her my full attention. Silence helps us be present with God by allowing time to quiet our thoughts and feelings. Without silence, our prayers tend to become our thoughts and feelings. Instead of relating with God and being present with Him, we fill our prayers with anxieties and fears, our need to please others or justify ourselves, or our need to avoid pain and discomfort. We push words at Him and believe that we are praying. But instead, we miss God because our list of demands get in the way of actually hearing from Him. The antidote is silence. The only way to listen is to stop talking. If silence is not a regular part of your spiritual rhythms, let me suggest a few ideas. Before you pray, however way you pray, always start with silence. Even if it's just a few seconds. But try beginning each prayer with 5 minutes or even 10 minutes of silence. Let God speak first. But in order to hear, we must first quiet the voices in our heads. Otherwise, we might mistake our own voices for God's. Another suggestion is try to practice silence and solitude for a longer period of time. Arrange a day or a few, if possible, for you to be alone with minimal demands and distractions. And with all my anxieties and ambitions clamoring for my attention, it's difficult to slow down long enough in the middle of the day to hear God. And during my sabbatical, I found that it generally took 1 to 2 whole days by myself just to calm down enough to start to hear anything other than my own thoughts. I've also found that if I don't actually plan and carve out time for God, it's difficult for me to ever find it. So what would it look like for you to prioritize silence enough to make time for it on your calendar? Spouses, how can you encourage one another by giving each other turns to be with God for a day or 2 or even a whole weekend? If silence has to do with hearing, then the second practice is seeing, which many of us have already been practicing with the prayer of examine. The Contemplatives teach that prayer is not our way to work to get God to notice us. Rather, it's noticing that God is already at work in us and all around us. As one writer puts it, God comes to you disguised as your life. Where else would God be but in life and reality itself? He made it all and He called it good. Everything comes from Him and returns to Him. He's not sitting on a cloud watching from afar. He promised to be with us always, even to the end of the age. As the psalmist writes, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence?" He's everywhere. We just have to open our eyes and train them to see. Contemplative prayer isn't all about silence and solitude. It's also the state of being fully alive in the life God gives in the here and now, just as Jesus did when he walked the earth. For many, prayer is used as an escape from reality or a desperate plea to change it. But contemplative prayer can give us the power to fully embrace reality and live in it, both the good and the bad, the beautiful and the broken. Why? Because God is in it all. He can be found in the dark just as much as he can be found in the light. I mean, how else can we rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in all circumstances? How else could the Apostle Paul be perfectly content, whatever the circumstances, whether in need or plenty, whether well-fed or hungry, unless God were in it? Seeing and being aware of God's presence in everything is the secret to joy. There is no circumstance or experience that doesn't have God hidden in it somewhere. Every moment has something true to teach us. He's there when you feel nervous going into that job interview. He's there when you're caring for your sick parent. He's there when your crying baby wakes you up for the third time at 4 a.m. Contemplative prayer is about asking, where is God in this blessing, or in this suffering, or even in this neutral moment? Where is God when I'm eating pancakes or sitting in a chair or laughing with friends? Where is God in this election cycle? Where is God in my anger and pain? Where is God in the people I disagree with? Prayer is not the vehicle to escape somewhere far away where God is. The secret to prayer is that God is already near, and we simply need to be quiet and be still enough to notice. In a few moments, we will celebrate Holy Communion. And I'd like to encourage us to do more than just go through the motions today. Let's receive communion contemplatively, meaning let's look and see. God is hidden in ordinary things. The spiritual world is hidden in the physical. It's just ordinary bread and wine, but also it's so much more because God is in it. This is no mere bread and wine. We are eating and drinking union with Christ. We're receiving his flesh and blood broken and poured out for us as spiritual nourishment. Don't just eat it and drink it. Close your eyes and savor it. Taste God's grace on your palate. Swallow it and let his love fill your belly and radiate throughout your whole body. Friends, God is with you. He is in the bread and wine. He is among us in fellowship. And he invites us, saying, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest."